won't back down. No, I won't back down. You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down.
We're in Daniel chapter 3 today, and last week Cody caught Daniel chapter 2. And just to quickly recap, kind of bring us back up to speed on the passage today, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had a dream where a massive statue was in front of him, and it frightened him. And the only person who could interpret the dream was Daniel. Daniel went on in the passage to explain the meaning of the dream and predicted the rise and fall of several empires with stunning accuracy, so accurate, in fact, that secular historians deny. They say there's no way he could have known this. This had to be written after the fact. It was added in later on because there's no way someone could ever see what Daniel saw. But of course, we know the power of God. It's universally accepted that the empires represented in the vision are Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome in that order. But then there's some debate about the feet of the statue and whether that's a future end time kingdom or simply part of the Roman Empire. As Cody mentioned last week, do the research, reach your own conclusion. It's not something that's a salvation issue. We can disagree and still be friends. But the best and brightest minds in Christianity have never agreed on some of the things in Daniel. And that's been going on for 2,000 years. And so instead of focusing on the things that people can't seem to agree on, I would encourage you as we go through the study to focus on what we can agree on. And everybody agrees that the rock in that passage is Jesus. And Daniel 2:44 said, during the reign of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness. I love that. And it will stand forever. So Jesus is the king of God's kingdom. We are citizens of that same kingdom. And unlike the ancient or current superpowers, God's kingdom is not a place you can point to on a map. It's not a nation with a government and with armies or borders. It's a kingdom that exists within all the kingdoms of the world. And we see glimpses of it even right now as God's people gather. As this is a kingdom expression. When Christ returns, however that goes down, and there is debate about that too, the kingdom of God will finally and fully be established and will stand forever, and we will reign victorious with Christ. And if you believe that, you better say amen. Amen. So after hearing his scary dream explained, you might think Nebuchadnezzar straightened up a little bit. He just got a little preview from this God that he knew nothing about, and you think he'd maybe fall in line and maybe start following God, but that basically didn't happen. He had a frightening dream of a vision of a statue in chapter 2, and in chapter 3 he decides to build one, as one does. So this is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and some of you know this story because of a VeggieTales video called Rack, Shack, and Benny. Anybody remember Rack, Shack, and Benny? Okay. It's a story of three vegetables who find themselves in trouble with a giant pickle. I love that movie. But this isn't a story about vegetables, and it's not really a children's story. It's kind of a scary tale. We'll start in chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. 90 feet is massive. We're not sure exactly what the statue looked like, but it was huge. Some people think it was a statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. Some believe it was a giant obelisk, which is something that was current in those days. The text simply doesn't say. It's likely that it was 90 feet and not solid gold, but probably a wooden frame that was overlaid with gold. For reference, an NFL goalpost is 45 feet tall. So it was twice as tall as an NFL goalpost. It would have been very impressive and shiny, right? Verse 2. Then he sent messages to the high officers, the officials, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers. Daniel loves lists. Judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. And so all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Once it was finished, he called all the important people, essentially. Daniel could have just said, he called all the important people from Babylon to dedicate this statue. But it wasn't just a monument, it was an object of worship. And this is difficult for us to understand because most people around us don't pray to statues anymore. You know, the other day I was out walking in the morning praying, and I was on the trail, and I got to the visitor center, and I saw the bronze statue of I.B. Perrine, right? And I've seen a lot of people take selfies with old I.B. and his impressive bowler hat, but I've never seen someone bow down before that statue and pray, because most people don't really pray to statues anymore. But there are plenty of false gods around. They just aren't that obvious. And there's plenty of people worshiping false gods, but it's just not so obvious. In verse 4, a herald shouted, "People of all races, nations, and language, listen to the king's command." Remember in week 1, we talked about how Babylon would conquer an area and then mix the people all up, right, on purpose, so they wouldn't be able to unite and rebel. And so here that's kind of reflected in verse 4. When you hear the sound, and another list, ready? The horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. What's going on here might seem like just another pagan act of worship in the Old Testament, but there's a little more that's happening here. This was a demand of allegiance. People were summoned and instructed to comply. Pledge your allegiance to Babylon. And it wasn't a suggestion. Verse 6 says, anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. You know, throughout history, secular and biblical, Babylon is a word that gets used almost metaphorically to describe evil, to describe people who are set against God. But it's more than that. What Nebuchadnezzar was doing was elevating his nation, his ideology, his culture above all things. He wasn't just like having people bow to a statue. He was deifying Babylon. He wasn't just asking people to worship these gods. He was declaring that Babylon was God. And he demanded that they give their allegiance to it. It's very similar to what happened in World War II with the Third Reich. Pledge your allegiance to the Fuhrer. Pledge your allegiance to this flag. Pledge your allegiance to this national identity that swept through Germany. Idolizing national identity above all else, drunk on power, worshiping dominant culture. This image embodied their national identity. And so this guy gets on the PA system and says, we're going to strike up the band and you have to bow down, and if you don't, we'll burn you to death. Again, not really a children's story. You've got a moment to decide. Your life is on the line. What do you do? You can imagine what most people did. In fact, verse 7 says, at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So if these are the choices, like I can burn to death or bow down to the gold statue, that seems pretty straightforward, right? The only thing that I can even think of that comes close to something like this in our own country is the national anthem. Right? The music strikes up, everyone stands, the men take off their hats, you cross your heart and you sing the song. Or maybe the Pledge of Allegiance. You stand up and cross your heart and swear your oath, but there's no music with that. And by the way, I'm not against either of those things. It's worth noting that people make good pledges all the time. Pledges of marriage, pledges of citizenship, pledges of a financial nature. This thing was a little different because it was worship. These are pagan people who were drunk on the power of their mighty nation, and they were more than happy to bow. But not everybody joined in, and you kind of know where this is going if you know the stories. In verse 8, some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. I don't know if you've had the same experience, but there's always a tattletale, There's always someone that's going to rat people out, and somebody, one of these astrologers, went and tattled on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king." That's how you start when you want to butter up a king. "You issued a decree requiring that all people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of," and then he lists all the instruments again: the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and other musical instruments. Daniel, do we have to list them all every time? He's like, well, that one dude wails on the zither, you know. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. They're like reminding the king what he knows he said. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. And then they list 3 charges. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you set up. Now you have to remember that Daniel and his young friends gained influence and prominence. They were promoted and given status in the kingdom. They were in charge of, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in charge of the province of Babylon. It's worth wondering, where's Daniel? He never gets mentioned in this. Well, Daniel was a higher ranking official, and he probably was on the king's business elsewhere in the kingdom. They were more local. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were local guys, but he was even higher ranked, and so he was probably off somewhere handling the king's business. So they didn't bow down to the statue. It was noticed. No doubt these astrologers were envious of these Jewish men and their status. And so they accused them of 3 things. They don't pay attention to you, King Nebi. They refuse to serve your gods, and they won't worship the statue. In other words, they will not give their allegiance to Babylon. They will not bend the knee to the dominant culture. And the obvious question is, why? Why not, right? Why not just, stoop down for that moment, get it over with, and then go on to live a full and productive life? They would not bow to Babylon. There's actually a great third day song called Never Bow Down, and it tells the story of this song. If you haven't listened to it, check it out. So Nebuchadnezzar flies into a rage, and he ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. I read this week and I thought, I wonder why he was so mad, right? Like, he's a king of a massive kingdom. He heard that a couple people wouldn't go with the program. And so it's easy for him just to go, well, okay, throw him in the furnace and send a message to everybody. But he got mad. Why did he get mad? Why is he personally offended? And I think it's because he knew these men. It wasn't like someone somewhere won't do what I said. It's like he knows these guys, and he interpreted their defiance as disobedience or disrespect. And so but they weren't being disrespectful, were they? I mean, they didn't make a stir. They didn't try to lead a revolt. They didn't start an angry mob. They just didn't join in. It was passive resistance. It's more like, Gandhi than Braveheart here, okay? They just kind of sat it out. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the gold statue I've set up?" He thought maybe there was some kind of a discrepancy. Maybe they just need another chance. And so he says, "I'll give you one more chance to bow and worship the statue I've made when you hear the sound." And he doesn't list them this time, thank God. "But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace." Once again, this egotistical man threatens to burn people to death, right? Do what I say or else. And that's the spirit of Babylon that is alive and well. We see it in dictators around the world. Conform or we'll kill you. That's the Sharia law of Afghanistan or the communist government of North Korea. Do what we say or we'll kill you. Well, Nebuchadnezzar said something else, something that's scandalous in my mind. He said, "And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Wow, the arrogance of that man. Did you hear what he said? I know God heard. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you." Isn't that gutsy? I mean, the kind of sand or grit to look someone in the eye who's threatening to kill you and say, I don't need to explain myself to you. Really? Wow. These men did not plead their case. They didn't beg. They didn't ask for considerations. They didn't ask for a religious exemption. They didn't try to convert him. Why? Because they believed that they answered to a higher authority. And man, there is an example there for us to follow. There will be times when people don't understand us. There will be times when people are offended by our stance on an issue. There will be times when people criticize us and mock us for not joining in and doing what everyone is doing. There will be times when people demand our allegiance, insist on our support, pressure us to pledge ourselves to some cause. And it's okay to say, we don't need to explain ourselves to you. I don't need you to understand why I do what I do or think what I think or say what I say. I answer to a higher authority. As disciples of King Jesus, guys, there are things we cannot do. There are places we cannot go, and it's sad. There are things we cannot do, places we cannot go, causes we can't join, issues we can't align ourselves with. When you're wrestling with those matters, you can say to yourself, and maybe to others, I answer to a higher authority. And when you're criticized or accused or maligned or marginalized or threatened, you can say with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and thousands and hundreds of thousands of Christians throughout history who simply said, I don't need to defend myself to you. Well, they had one more thing to say to him. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He just said, what God will be able to save you? And they said, our God is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power. Rescue us from your power, your majesty. I love the faith of these young men. They were staring down the muzzle of a torturous death. The fiery furnace awaited them, and somewhere in the background, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were singing, I Won't Back Down. Our God is able to save. Remember what Nebuchadnezzar said previously? What God will be able? And they said, our God is able. They had confidence in the power of God in this situation. I hope we have that kind of confidence. There's a man in our church that's got cancer, and he talks about God like this, with great faith. There's a man in our church with a disability who talks about God like this, with great faith. There are mothers in this church whose children aren't walking with Jesus, but they talk about the power of their God for their children's souls with great faith, because they believe, like these men believe, that our God is able. And this is not a case of name it and claim it, okay? Or as Bram says, blab it and grab it. That always kills me. There are people who think that boldly claiming something and putting God's name on it obligates God to do what you want. Good luck with that. These men had confidence that God could save them. But here's what they said next, and I love this. But even if he doesn't, now wait a minute. They just said, we're confident that God can save us, but even if he doesn't, I think that's a great approach to things that we ask for by faith. Even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. It's like they looked at King Nebuchadnezzar and said, do your worst. You'll never get us to do what you want us to do. They had boldness. They had great faith. They seemed fearless in the face of death, but they were also willing to accept God's plan, even if it wasn't their plan. They were hoping that they weren't going to die a fiery death, but they realized that what I want and what God wants may not be the same thing. You see the distinction? So when we're praying for great things, I think it's okay to say, God, I know you can heal me. I know you can heal my loved one, but even if you don't, I know you can turn this thing around, but even if you don't, I'm begging you for things to go this way. But even if it doesn't, I surrender to your will. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Father, I'm asking you to spare me from the horrors of the cross, but not my will, but yours be done. So many times Christians expect God to do what they want him to do. They're counting on God to do their will. They're so convinced that God must see things their way, and then they're devastated or furious or faithless when things don't go the way they imagine them. Why does God allow what he allows? Why does God intervene sometimes and then not other times? Why doesn't God give me what I want? Because all my desires are pure, of course. Why doesn't God give what I beg him for? I don't know the answer to all those questions specifically, but I know the answer generally. He's God, and I'm not. He is able, right? But his will be done, not mine. And you can imagine how that went over with the king. Verse 19 says, Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He got that angry face on. He was like spitting and drooling and snarling and red, and he's so mad. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. What a maniac, right? I'm going to kill you with hotter fire. It's like, oh no. Ironically, hotter fire would probably make them suffer less, just saying. But he was so mad he couldn't see straight. And then I love some of these. You can just see he's like a man that's so enraged. He's just not thinking clearly. He ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. You don't need strong men. They were tied up. You don't need elite soldiers. They weren't resisting, right? Like, this doesn't even make sense. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes. The lists go on and on with Daniel. The pants, turbans, robe. They had pink socks on. It's like, come on, Daniel, skip a bit. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So the king paid a stupid tax on that one. He made the fires so hot that he killed his elite soldiers. Good one. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. There's a great old picture of this. I don't know if you guys have ever stumbled upon Gustave Doré. He's a French artist, and he did all these pictures of like Bible stories and stuff. They're really cool. There's this little picture of that. I love imagining the scene. There's probably a crowd gathered. Whenever you execute someone, you want the word to get out, right? So you gather a crowd, and the idea was when they watch these people die, they get the idea like, don't mess with the king. So they were thrown into or shoved into this furnace, and that was the end of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But wait, verse 24, suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? You don't even need fingers to count that one, right? 3, 1, 2, 3. Yes, Your Majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th one looks like a god. Now, the language here, literally in the original language, is a son of the gods, but that was actually a phrase that was used to speak of anything that was divine. So the NLT actually got it right. Anytime it was son of the gods, was saying like a heavenly being of any kind. 3 men went into the furnace, but the king saw 4 inside. Who was that 4th man? Now, there's actually 2 options, which might surprise you. Most people commonly think angel, and it'll say that later when Nebuchadnezzar weighs in on this. That's a solid answer and could very well be right. But there's something else in the Old Testament that I'll just mention to you for the Bible nerds in the room. I know who you are. There's a thing that the scholars call a Christophany. And that's the word to describe when Jesus shows up in the Old Testament. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that. So it's possible that this son of the gods could have been actually the Son of God. It's kind of interesting to think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walking around eating ice cream cones with Jesus in the fiery furnace. But whatever the case, don't miss the point, they didn't burn. I would have loved to have seen the look on that guy's face. Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." You notice how instantly he gets humble? He's forcing people to bow down to statues and pledge allegiance to Babylon, and instantly he's talking about the Most High God, the God of the men he persecuted, by the way. And how did he know about their God? From Daniel chapter 2. And from these men here in chapter 3. And he'll have the same experience, but in a bigger way next week in chapter 4. He's kind of a slow learner, but so are some of us. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. And then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. And it goes into detail. Not a hair on their head was singed. And their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Wow. They could have worn those clothes to work that day. Our God is able. Anybody remember that old song? He is able, more than able. Our God is able, more than able to save. I love the details. The hair was intact. The clothes weren't singed. They weren't even smoky. I can't get within 5 feet of my smoker without getting smoke on my clothes. And they were in the fiery furnace and did not have a hint of that. A stunning display of God's power. What God will be able to save you? Our God. He is able. Now there's a development here with the king. We'll see more of this next week. But King Nebuchadnezzar said something alarming. He said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel," see angel, "to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." That's summed up rather nicely. These men, our predecessors, would rather die than worship a false god. Now, some people might think that's just young dudes being tough, but I think it was a deep devotion to the one true God. I think it was a deep commitment to never compromise. It was a deep conviction of sincere faith. And it could have cost them their lives, but it did not. And the people who witnessed their defiance were inspired. That same unwillingness to compromise that eventually led, a couple hundred years after Jesus, led Rome to declare Christianity as their national religion, because it wouldn't matter what they did to those Christians, they would never turn their back on Christ. God's people standing firm. We don't use a lot of words like this to describe our faith, but unyielding, unmoved, unshaken, determined, faithful, strong. And Nebuchadnezzar had never seen men like this before. He was used to getting his way every time with everybody or else. And here's what he says in verse 29. Ready? "Therefore, I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or religion or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. He just couldn't help himself. Every order had to be followed up with a death threat. What is this guy's problem? And remember what he said in verse 15. Then what God is able, will be able to rescue you from my power. And here's what he said at the end. This is what he said at the end. There is no other God who can rescue like this. Cool story. One of those ones I remember from my childhood. One of those ones I shared with my kids through Veggie Tales. You know, we live in uncertain times. And there are a lot of things going on in our culture. And I don't want to, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in summary, but a lot of things that smack of this. I don't think we're there. We're not there. But this kind of current of like this allegiance to Babylon. My wife was joking yesterday. We made the universal mistake, go to Costco on Saturday, you know? And there's like hundreds and thousands of people. And she goes, I feel like we're like going to worship at Babylon. I was like, okay, maybe a sermon for a different day. There's things that we're all consumed with, things that are part of dominant culture that we all get excited about. And then there's these things where we're like, do this or else. Bow to the rainbow flag, you know, or else. Toe the company line. Support what the company supports or be fired. Embrace this ideology or be canceled. I'm not a prophet, and I'm not someone that actually is pessimistic. I'm pretty optimistic. But these things I don't think are going to get better. You know, as culture continues to like progress and we stay right where we're at in our traditional values, our biblical values, as America continues to get more secular, in our day, in our age, in our time, people are doing some scary things. They're saying some scary things. They're demanding some scary things. They're demanding unquestionable allegiance or else. And there are things that have people wondering if this is the end. We're in good company. People have wondered that for 2,000 years. Is this the end? Or is this just the beginning? And I don't know the answer to those questions. But here's what I learned from a pagan king drunk on his own power. There is no other God who can save. Our God has proved that by sending his Son, Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world.
Won't back down. No, I won't back down. You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down.